Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is my video how I painted my watercolor Sunflower and Friend, step by step. In this case, the friend happens to be a very small skipper butterfly who was flying about happily. He happened to get into the picture. To start out this video, you'll see me draw my sunflower, use masking fluid, and then create the background wet on wet. After that, I work into the flower, and petal by petal, layer by layer, and glaze by glaze, I develop some good rich color and shadows. I hope that you'll enjoy watching it. Give it a thumbs up, and let's paint. Sunflower and Friend. Pow! I walked out the back door, and there was an enormous sunflower blooming. It was not 6 feet from my back door, and it was gorgeous. Naturally, I took a photograph. I took 10 photographs, and then I got started on painting it. I'm starting with a sketch. This sunflower filled my photo frame, and it's just what I wanted my painting to do as well. The lighting was dramatic and bright, so I sketched it out, and then I used masking fluid to block in the areas that were really sunlit, because they were so striking against the dark background. Everywhere from my reference photo where there was a very bright sunlit yellow, I masked it out, as well as some areas of leaves and other things that caught the sunlight strong. I got all the masked areas done and dry, and now I'm beginning on the background. Everywhere I want some background color, I'm carefully painting around the sunflower petals. This is working wet on wet, and I needed to be very brilliant with my colors because the background was quite dark. There was also some really cool images caught in the background where the sunlight was playing on the leaves and the trees and the surroundings. Meanwhile, I'm painting between petals and trying not to overlap or go into those petal areas. So I decided to take it section by section, because by the time I finished painting the whole background, one area would have already been dry. So I'm just taking one little piece at a time, wetting it down, and then applying the colors that I wanted to use. I'm using my colors quite concentrated because I want them to be dark. Of course, I'll have to go back and layer some more in there. I'm also using a lot of little dots of color, because that's sort of how the light looked coming through the leaves that were behind the sunflower, and the skylight as well coming through the leaves. And I don't see anything wrong with leaving some pure whites showing through all this, because I think it adds some interest. So I started completing the right side of the background first, and I will work my way around, adding water to wet the areas as I work on them. I am using some odd mixes of colors, including purple and green, as well as ultramarine blue and cerulean blue. But I feel like they look natural and I like them. Now I'm working toward the top of the background. And I've wet the area and I'm coming carefully between the petals. And you can see the petals are starting to get defined as well as the flower by the background being dark. Ideally, this is the way to work for me in a subject and background study. The background painted first, and then the subject painted on top, although tweaking back and forth can always be working. I'm using some mauve in the background here. And my darks are being made with Hooker's Green Dark and Indigo. I do like the way layers of different colors mixed together and on top of each other add a natural feeling to the colors I'm using. One thing I do tend to shy away from is just plain green out of the tube. My greens are almost always mixed, whether it's with burnt sienna, blue, yellow ochre, indigo, orange, or so many other colors. Because I feel greens vary so much in nature. And if you have a good variety of different colors of green, you're going to get a much more natural looking painting out of it. The form of the sunflower itself was so lovely that I could play around with the background and allow it to go where it wanted to, as long as it defined that beautiful form. What I'm doing is masking my flower and putting a little spatter painting onto some areas of the background, just to add some naturalness and some spontaneity. Those sections done, I'm now coming down to complete the very bottom of the background section. And then I define one of the flower petals with a leaf that is actually behind it. And another leaf up toward the top that was very sunlit. The background is dry at this point, where I'm starting to work on the secondary layer. You can see I'm mixing a lot of yellow into my leaf where the sunlight is directly on it, because I want this to be striking as well. Sunflower leaves have a fine layer of hairs on them. So I've tried very hard in this foreground leaf to show this texture with some dry brush work at almost every step of the way. After these leaves are clearly defined, I can add the remaining background that I see around them and behind them. And that was quite dark. Can you see where it's showing up against the masked petals, which will be quite bright and light? That's going to create a nice little dramatic moment right there. You see also how I'm leaving an edge of light along the side of the leaves. That will allow me to adjust it and yet keep it light and bright. Things are dry and I'm going back to add some more colors to the background. I had decided that the left side faded and was a little bit too light in color. I wanted to add some interest on that side, as well as working on that area of light, which is actually supposed to be a light beam shooting through the picture, a ray of sunlight. And I wanted to soften it and add some more of the rainbow colors I saw on each side. I also wanted to richen the background and make it a little bit deeper in color in some areas where it faded as it dried. So I'm glazing more layers of color onto the background in some sections. And some strong deeps with some indigo. And into the interior of the sunflower I go, adding a layer of yellow and adding a lot of little dots of stippled texture. I'm using mauve, yellow, chrome orange, and burnt sienna. I'm also using some vermilion, and I'm doing a lot of little dots to try to capture the texture and the anatomy of the inside of the sunflower. It's almost like pointillism. There was many little dots applied, but I thought that was the best way to try to capture the texture. I'm doing a test strip up top, using different shades of yellows combined with oranges to try to get just the right color combination for what I'm looking for this plant, for this flower, and for the petals. After all those little stippled dots have been applied, I go over them and allow them to blend and soften in their texture as I add some additional shading overall. This is a three-dimensional structure, the interior of the sunflower. It sticks out, so it's lower around the edges and higher toward the middle. So I'm trying to shade it as well as texture it. There are even some little sections where the interior of the seed pot area there is green. So I'm adding some greens. And I'm looking very closely at how the flower petals are attached to the middle. I'm trying to detail the actual anatomy of how they go together. And back to my color patch test strip. Getting some colors I'm starting to like and feel comfortable working with for the flower petals, as well as the shading that they're going to have. Cadmium yellow. Petal by petal, I'm going to be looking over my photograph, my reference, to see what each petal looks like. I'm not going to assume they're all the same color because of the lighting and the shadows. They were not the same color. In some areas they were just as bright as could be and full of sunlight. And in others, there were some very strong, dramatic, and dark shadows. And that was part of the beauty of this flower that struck me as I walked out my back door. So I'm going to travel around the flower, petal by petal, painting what I see, or trying to paint what I see. In the confusing interim, I picked out the individual petals with a little bit of brush sketching because I needed to see which ones went on top of the other ones, and the white mass that they'd all run into was a little confusing. So here I'm giving myself some definition so I could see what's on top and what's underneath before I proceed to paint in more. So I've painted on the yellow, and then I've painted on a slightly darker shade with some cadmium orange mixed into it to allow slight color variation and some shading on one side. And I'm even using several different shades of yellow. Where one petal overlaps the other, I'm adding a shadow. And that's with a slightly darker shade of yellow, mixed with some vermilion, some yellow ochre, some orange, or even some burnt sienna. And moving ahead, I've progressed a bit further around the flower, but I'm still taking each petal one by one. And several of the petals have some pretty heavy masking on them as well. If I paint every other petal, then by the time I come back to the first one, it's often dry between. And I want to paint these one by one and not all run together in a blob. One by one allows me shading, overlap, and individual colors on each petal. If I'd done them all at the same time, they would have run together. That would be fine for a looser painting. This painting has some degree of control and tightness about it. So I'm painting some groups of petals that are the same tone. By the time I go back to them, I will be able to do individual shading between them. Without it running all over the place. One of the objects of my shading is to not change the color of the whole petal, but just a section that might be in shadow, whether it's because it's being overlapped by something else or because of the light and the way the light is shining on it. Deepening the foreground leaf and trying to keep that dry brush along the edge to show how it is a textured leaf with lots of little hairs on it. What looks like the last unfinished petal at the top of the flower is actually a little butterfly. So interesting. When I took the photographs, I didn't even notice the little guy who was flying on and off and landing all about the sunflower. I believe his name is a skipper butterfly. And since he was in my photographs, almost every single one of them, I decided to include him in my painting as well, which is why I called it Sunflower and Friend. And my petals have dried, and I'm going back in and around them. I'm trying to put a little more contrast around some of them by adding some darks outside of them. I'm also trying to clean up some of my edges where they might have gotten a little raggedy, because I want the edges to be smooth in this painting. So here we go. It is getting more contrast. I will be working that darker color outward so that it blends and doesn't look all like it's outlined. And I'm cleaning up my edges of my petals at the same time because the petal leaves are smooth. They aren't raggedy. This goes one by one for every single petal. My flower petals have dried, and I am now richening the tone and beginning to add the shadows which were shining very dramatically on some of the flower. At this point, I'm marking out where the shadow is and not making it very dark. But the shadows were coming on as bands of color, where the overlapping petals We're having the sunshine on them and casting shadows and shades beneath them. Again, I am blocking out where the shadows will be. These will be getting much darker. In order to make a shaded flower, however, you have to have shadows in some areas as it moves in and out of the light. A little darker on some of the shadows now as I add a second layer. And begin to work on the shading in the interior of the flower where the seeds will be formed. I'm using a combination of oranges and mauves and purples, as well as vermilion. I find these colors together can be quite beautiful and make a unique pattern. And now, the remaining masking is coming off. And these will be my brilliant areas where I really want to sparkle against the darker areas. And I'm hoping to add a lot of drama by doing this. Very pale, pale whites and yellows. And keeping those sparkling light areas very clean. I have to use clean water and I have to use a clean paintbrush or I'll lose my effect. And here comes some of those bold shadows right on top and around the brilliant areas. And I am getting darker at this point. I can feel some of the dimensionality of the flower developing as I add these darks and try to keep these very light areas light. I'm mixing together yellow ochre and mauve, as well as a little bit of quin magenta to get this shading shadow color. And I feel that the color of the flower is getting quite rich at this point. From watching me, you know there are at least 3 layers on every single area. At this point, it's a matter of going around and around the petals and the flower to try to make each one adjusted to the colors that I want. But in the meantime, I could begin to define the lines of the little butterfly that has landed on the sunflower. I paint in his darks, and then I begin to bring in his lighter colors with some detailing. I'm trying to keep him as defined as I can on the flower. Because I do want him to stand out as a separate part and not as another petal. He has tiny little veins and folds in his wings. He has small spots, small stripes. So I am painting these areas in and taking a lot of care on this little tiny creature. Carefully painting around the butterfly as well, to make sure he stands out as much as he should against the petals around him. I'm adding some darker spots to the tiny little butterfly, as well as painting in his small legs that are standing on the center of the flower. Coming back in with some much stronger darks for the center to add some of the drama of the color. And then these darker colors will be coming out into the petals in some areas to add some drama to them as well. As I'm working, I'm also continuing to smooth out the surface of the petals to keep them soft. I'm also blending them just a little bit with some dampness and water into the background so the edges are not quite as hard. I'm putting a little bit more darkness into the background for balance as well. And richening the center area of the sunflower with another glaze of color. looking closely at the patterns that the small seeds to be will form in the middle of the flower and trying to add some of those. Another glaze for some of the petals for more rich color, and then enhancing the shadows that are on some of the petals as well. I've gone back into the background and added a little bit more depth and brilliance of color to make the sunflower stand out even more. I'm picking up on a shadow on the leaf as well, and darkening my shadows on the petals again. Each time your painting dries, you'll want to take a look at it again. See what needs to be adjusted. See where it's dark enough, see where it needs a little more color or another glaze. And that's what I've been doing throughout this whole process of painting this. When you do evaluate, try your best to get a distance from it, at least 6 feet or across the room. It will give you a better idea and some better objectivity for evaluating your work as it's progressing. And there is my cover-up technique to see where it needs it. And I said I'm done, and I am signing this. And that was that. I hope you enjoyed my video, Sunflower and Friends, Step by Step. You know, I was fortunate to sell it almost as soon as I completed it. And if anyone else is ever interested in buying original work, I'm just a message away. For my videos, you can subscribe and ring the bell below not to miss the next one. And I have links also below to some of the products I use. Click on Show More in order to see all the links that I have. I have my Facebook art page link, my blog, and my product store. I will see you next video.